The chief character traits of a Jewish woman are modesty, being reserved, being home-oriented, and when in public, never at the forefront, more in the background. If I look at myself and how I've been educated and how I have lived all my life in the Western civilization, I see I do not fit this profile. Due to a mix of natural inclination and education training, I graduated from the Polytechnic and have worked all my life in a very competitive and stressful work environment. When I try to imagine what role I could have had as a woman in a Jewish community, I cannot find an answer. The answer I'm looking for is a role that I could embody without being disruptive for the community. Does this mean that my soul is not fit for conversion? Although I love and admire everything about Judaism, and I know that being a Jew is the highest calling and the best function in this present world? Question mark.
Okay. So it's a complicated question. What I would say is this. Those are some of the qualities of a Jewish woman, but I wouldn't say those are all of the qualities of a Jewish woman. That's quite limited. And some of those apply to men as well. Meaning that one of the qualities that we speak about, and often it's applied inappropriately just to women, is something called tzniut, which is often translated as modesty. And people often think that it's a directive that only applies to women. It's not really true. Modesty is something that is a character trait that applies to men and to women. It's more involved when it comes to women's dress. There's more concern about the particulars of how women dress, but men are also required to dress with a certain amount of modesty. Modesty may not be the best translation, by the way, of tzniut. I have a good friend of mine who would translate it as gracefulness, but there are other ways of translating it. In any event, the best way for me to answer this particular person's question is to say that if the concern is, again, about conversion, to say that there's no personality profile that is administered for people that are converting. Meaning that while there is a character trait that we're supposed to cultivate as we go through life, the character traits of humility, of modesty. This is not equivalent to, let's say, the concepts of being gregarious versus being, what's the opposite of gregarious? Someone who is the English word is slipping my mind now. Introvert. This is not what it's talking about. It's not talking about introvert versus extrovert. So the reality is that among spiritual Jewish women who do, again, cultivate these character traits of humility and modesty, some will be women who are extroverts and some would be women who are introverts. And regarding the question of whether to assume a public role in life, this is something which you could say is a little bit determined by the nature of the Jewish community we're talking about. Meaning that when I spoke before about Jewish law falling along a spectrum, so Jewish communities also fall along a spectrum. There are different standards you'll find within different segments of the Jewish community. So, for example, in a Hasidic community, women will comport themselves differently than in, let's say, a modern Orthodox community. They're all Torah observant. They're all serious Torah observant Jews, but they're different communities. You can't say one is more legitimate than the other. They're just different. Now, I would have said maybe a while ago that this question about whether women can be in a public role in life versus having to always be private and in the background, I might have been tempted to say this is a community issue, a community difference. But the reality is that that's in itself is an overgeneralization. Let me give you a few examples. When I first started studying Judaism, which was in the early 1970s, I was at Yeshiva University in New York, and there was a woman who came to speak to us in 1973. Her name was Rebbetzin Esther Jungreis. Now, she was a bit controversial because she was what you might call an ultra-Orthodox woman, and yet she was planning a Torah rally at Madison Square Garden. Madison Square Garden is one of the larger arenas in New York. Usually there are sporting events there and concerts there. I think they hold about 10 to 15,000 people. And she was planning a Torah rally at Madison Square Garden where she was going to be the featured speaker. So here, she wasn't going to be sitting in the background and knitting, and baking cookies. She was the star. And she was going to be up there preaching and speaking in front of this huge crowd of 15,000 people. And I was at that program. So she's an example of someone that was she wasn't hiding in the background, if you want to put it in those terms. Today in Brooklyn, there is a Hasidic woman, you can look her up online, who is a federal judge in the New York court system. Not only did she go to law school and become a lawyer, she became a judge and now is a federal judge. I just read an obituary yesterday about a wonderful Orthodox woman who passed away. I think she was 67 years old and one of the top anesthesiologists in the world. So here she was not, and she was from a very Hasidic background, meaning that in her community, women did not go to university in general, but she did. And so what I would say is that it could be that part of this question is assuming a community difference, meaning there are differences in communities where, let's say, in a more right-wing or Hasidic or ultra-Orthodox kind of community, women do tend to stay at home in general because they have lots of kids. I have my neighbors across the street are Bobover Hasidim, and they have 15 children. So, this woman stayed at home. She wasn't going to have time to go to university. And in general, they don't really go out into the community in general and do things in the world out there. But there are exceptions, like Rebbetzin Jungreis and this judge, I forget her name now. There are plenty of Hasidic women, ultra-Orthodox women who broke the mold, go to university, go to graduate school, get doctorates, etc. But when it comes to other parts of the Jewish world, there it's not even a question. There, there's no premium placed upon being in the background and not assuming a public role or a leadership role. So basically what you'll find is, number one, when it comes to whether women should be assuming a public role in life and being out front and in public, you could say that to a degree it is a community-based issue in general. But even within the most restrictive communities, there are exceptions where there are women who assume any possible role you can imagine. A good example would be Chabad. Chabad is a Hasidic group where they have plenty of women in Chabad that are out there teaching They're online, they're giving lectures, they're public, they're out front. Um, you know, so again, I would say to this woman asking the question that regardless of how public a person's going to be and what kind of a public life they're going to have, whether they're a man or a woman, one of the things that we are supposed to be working on and cultivating are the character traits of modesty and humility, not being brash, not being brazen. And that's probably the most important aspect of a person's spiritual life. I would say, by the way, for Noachites as well, is that when you think about what are we here in this world to do, we're primarily here to work on our character traits, to build ourselves as human beings. In Genesis, God said, "Let us make man in our image." And who is God speaking to when he says, "Let us make man"? According to the Hasidic masters, he's speaking to every human being who will ever live. He's telling each one of us, you have to create yourself. That's what you are here in this world to do. You're not like an elephant or a giraffe. Elephants and giraffes don't become more of an elephant or more of a giraffe as they get older. They might become bigger and heavier, but they don't grow in their giraffeness. They don't grow in their lionness or their tigerness. A human being can become a greater human being, can become a more developed human being. And that's our mandate in life, is to create ourselves. God says he cannot create us. He can give you the raw ingredients, he can give you a body and a soul, but what you will become is a function of what you do with those raw ingredients. So the basic task of any human being is to perfect their character traits. And some of these, I mean, they're not exhausted by humility and modesty, but those are two important ones, right? Other ones would be generosity and being someone who's grateful and someone who is sensitive and someone who is kind and someone who is generous and someone who is forgiving, etc. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of character traits that we can work on. And so it's not limited to women. And even women who work on their modesty and their humility, that doesn't preclude them from having a public role in life.